Hi there. Welcome to the first in a series of webinars being put on by Library Strategies about the importance of planning. I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Stu Wilson. Stu and I have worked together for more years than I can think of right now. Stu is a principal consultant at Library Strategies and has been with us he is one of our first principal consultants that we brought on. He's the former executive director of the Friends of the Hennepin County Library. And he's also a former vice president of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, where Library Strategies resides. He's got more than 25 years of experience in fundraising, strategic planning. He works really well with boards, doing board development, which is very critical in today's age of libraries and needing to be managed by really strong boards.
And this is Sue Hall. Sue Hall's the director of Library Strategies and one of the principal consultants, and has been doing consulting for over 20 years with libraries and library organizations and nonprofit organizations as well. So a host of experience with all kinds of organizations. Sue has actually designed and facilitated strategic and development planning processes across the country, and really was the developer of our rapid results process, and frequently speaks at national and state conferences. So we're a great team, and we have a host of other consultants as well.
A little bit about Library Strategies before we get into today's topics. Library Strategies was created about 10 years ago at the request of a lot of libraries who were coming to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is our library's foundation. Our foundation has been very successful, and other libraries and library organizations wanted to know how we managed our success. So in response to these requests, we created Library Strategies. Library Strategies in those 12 years has worked with libraries and library organizations, the American Library Association, and other organizations that work with libraries in 33 states and in Eastern Europe.
Library Strategies is pretty unique in that we're the only consulting group based in a library, and we only work with libraries. We pretty much can do consulting in any area of needs that libraries or library organizations have. Some of the major areas we work in are strategic planning, fundraising of all kinds, feasibility studies for capital campaigns themselves, working with friends and foundations in many different areas, and development planning. We have a host of other services as well, and really if you're interested in our services, we'd be happy to talk to you.
So this first webinar in the Importance of Planning series is going to be about preparing to plan. Too often people decide that they're going to do strategic plans. A library decides it's time, our plan is our current plan is running out of time. And so they jump right into the planning process. And really, we think it's very helpful to actually take the time to prepare for the planning process and make sure you've got all your ducks in a row before you start your strategic planning process. The second in this webinar series is actually going to be information about our rapid results planning process. This is a process that we developed a little over 5 years ago and have worked with over 36 libraries doing the rapid results planning. So we'll be telling you about this in the second in the series. And finally, we're going to be doing a webinar on development planning. Development planning is where we look at how you're going to pay for your strategic plan. We look at friends and foundations and what their role is in supporting the library and the library's strategic plan. So a little bit about the rapid results planning process, because it's what's going to frame the 3 webinars that we're talking about. About 5 years ago, we began working with a library in White Plains, New York. The library had a new executive director, a new library director, who really wanted to understand the community and know what the community's needs were for strategic planning and for the library's role in the community. So he wanted to do something different than surveys and focus groups. He really wanted to engage the community in the planning process. So we looked at current planning processes that were out there and decided that what we really needed to do was create a new process that was stakeholder driven rather than being driven by the board and the staff of a library. And we needed to develop a process that was quick, didn't lose the integrity of planning, but you were able to do it in 3 or 4 months, didn't take lots of focus groups, which are very expensive, incorporated some of the foundational elements of looking at statistics and plans and so forth. But the process that we developed was more cost-effective and more directional. Rapid results planning is community-driven and it's community-focused, which basically or ultimately results in a plan that's the community's plan for the library, not the library's plan for the community. It's a big picture process, and what you get out of it is a big picture strategic plan with a vision and high-level goals. And then we work with library staff to get into the weeds of the strategic plan, and we help the staff create a very tactical implementation plan that looks at priorities and for the first year or 18 months of the plan and the action steps and who's going to do what and what resources are needed.
So why should libraries plan? I think it's a fundamental question, and you may get a sense that we're planning maniacs, but I think it's really a good question to ask. And one of the reasons for planning is really to meet your community's needs. Even though a host of many people come into a library every day, it doesn't necessarily mean that the library is touching all segments of the community. So a planning process really helps reach out into the community and get input in a variety of different ways into the future of where your library may want to go. The other thing, if there's one constant today, it's that everything is changing. Libraries are changing, communities are changing. We live in an ever-changing environment that is very fast-paced. And so a plan and a planning process really helps you get some control over that change and helps you provide a direction for when you are faced with nothing but change. I think a plan is also really important in that it gives you the strategies and the tactics to align with your mission, vision, and direction. Sometimes a plan includes a redo of mission and vision, but the direction is what's really important, of alignment of mission and vision and making sure that what the library is doing on a big picture and a tactical level really aligns with what you are trying to do for your community. And then lastly, the plan really keeps your library vital and growing. It really involves people. It involves a process that engages staff and your boards and your friends and foundation if you have them. And that really helps create a sense of where your library is going and a communal vision for your library in the future.
So one of the things that you want to do as you start out your strategic planning process is to really articulate what the process is going to look like. What's your plan going to look like? What's the life of your plan? We've seen that there are plans out there that go from 5 to 10 to 15 years, which our bias is that's way too long to predict in the library world with technology and community needs changing the way they are. Stu, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about process goals.
Sure. I think one of the things that's really important to look at the beginning, and I think most library directors are very good at this, is having a sense of what your goals are for the process. And so every library is very different. I think before you begin your process, you can look a little bit as the results, the goals for your process based on community and outreach into the community. Do you have particular service needs that you need addressed in your plan? Or do you have internal issues, funding, staff? And so I think if before you even begin the process and before you choose a facilitator or a planning help or a consultant, or if you're doing it internally, to really look at what your ultimate goals are and what some of your issues are at the beginning of the process. It will help you choose the right process and the right consultant if you're able to do that.
Another really key piece, and this is becoming more critical as time moves on, is to be able to align your strategic plan, the library strategic plan, with other plans. Cities, counties, towns, more than ever are doing master plans or community plans. And communities are also really looking at how do we attract and retain residents to our community. And so more often than not, town plans, city plans are looking at quality of life issues and where the anchors are in their community and how the anchors contribute to quality of life. often libraries are key players in that, why people move to a community, why they move to a neighborhood, and why they stay in the neighborhood. So one of the things that you really want to look at as you're beginning your planning process is your city's or your community's plans. Or the community plans of possible other organizations, whether they're major plans of other nonprofits like a United Way plan or a similar broad nonprofit plan that really talks about the community on a broad basis, and really ask yourself, where does the library fit into other organizations' plans as well? Oftentimes, communities look at hiring a facilitator to facilitate the process. That is our job, and it's a little self-serving that we talk about this, but it's also really important. Yes, a staff can facilitate its own plan. It's particularly done in a lot of small towns that can't afford a consultant, but there's even options for working on ways to be able to do this. But the really valuable role of a facilitator is, number one, to bring objectivity, to bring experience gained from other strategic planning processes to your process, and to really be able to keep the process on track and make sure that the deliverables, the objectives of the process are reached. That's a lot for a volunteer, say a board member or a library director, to do on top of their own jobs. The other thing that you really want to do at the outset of a planning process is set your planning timeline. Generally, strategic plans can take from 3 to 6 months. You have to look at when do you want to start it. It's really difficult to start a strategic planning process and do the meat of the process over the summertime when a lot of people go on vacations. You have to look at holidays. You really have to look at when are your key people who are involved in the process going to be available, and then work backwards from when you need your plan done to what's really the best timeline.
I think just to add something here, we've found that it's very helpful to have a short, expeditious process, 3 to 6 months. We've both lived through 2-year planning processes, and in many cases, by the time the planning process is done, no one wants to look at the plan again. So we've found that it's very critical to have a shortened timeline, if at all possible.
Yep. And to add to that, one of the things that we'll be talking about in the Rapid Results Planning webinar is that one of the first steps is to create a planning committee that's going to work with you. Doing something over 4 to 6 months, a defined period of time, makes it doable for recruiting volunteers who are going to commit their time to the process. And it creates momentum. When you stretch a process out over a year's time or longer, it's really hard to keep enthusiasm and real excitement about the planning process. Whereas if you're doing it in a more confined timeline, it's very easy to keep the enthusiasm and the energy of the planning process up. And finally, the thing that you want to do when you're looking at your whole process is identify your deliverables. Do you just want a strategic plan? Do you want a technology plan that's going to support it? Do you want to look at a development plan to work with your friends or foundations to determine how they're going to use their efforts to support the library and its strategic plan? Figure out what your deliverables are going to be. We're working on a process right now where one of the clients that we're working with really wanted us to dig in and do a community profile so that they could really look in depth at how their community is changing and thus be able to identify how the library needs to change to meet the needs of its residents.
So as Sue said, one of the first steps and a critical step in any planning process is creating a planning team or a planning committee, whatever you want to call it. The planning team is really designed to steer the whole process and to really finalize the plan before it goes to approval to a library board. We really believe that it's important to have a separate planning team, usually about 8 people, can be 12, can be 6, but a relatively contained group that really has the time and the energy and the focus to steer it. So the question is, who's on your team? Of course, you want leadership of your library board and leadership of your staff. I think for the library board, it's not usually, we don't usually recommend that the entire library board serve as your planning team because then it becomes too internal. We really believe that a planning team should have a little broader perspective. So typically, in addition to library board leadership and library staff leadership, we would also look to Friends and Foundation board members. Sometimes if a city council or county board is important, there might be a city council member or county board member who participates in your planning team. There might be a community member. Again, shaping that planning team is in part driven by what you want out of the process, but having some diversity on the planning team that will help steer the entire process and come up with a greater, more focused, broader community vision for your plan ultimately is really a key part of the process.
You know, I think I'd add to that, if you have strategic partnerships, if you work closely with your schools, or if you work closely with arts organizations on programming or services, you want your partners in the room because they're going to bring not only their own perspective, but they're going to broaden the perspective of your planning team. You really want to ask yourself, who's going to help us think out of the box and at the same time be committed to our plan?
Right, absolutely.
I think the next piece that you want to think about is data gathering. More and more, we are seeing that libraries want to have data-driven processes. And we really encourage libraries to have balanced processes, data gathering and input from real people and real stakeholder groups. So as you look at the data gathering piece, the first thing that most libraries want to do is they want to look at the vital statistics, both their own statistics, what do their collections look like, and their circulation and their visits. These are vital statistics on the part of a library. And so they want to do a data audit of that. They also want to do a data audit, a look at the demographics in the town. Is the town growing? Is economic development growing? Are there growth of new immigrant populations? Are there more seniors in the community now? Are there more growing millennials? And how is the plan maybe going to look at these various population groups? You really want to look at library trends and benchmarking. The last thing that you should be doing as you do your strategic plan is thinking only about how your library works. There's so many exciting things going on in other libraries now, and there are so many trends that are changing rapidly in what libraries do and what their role is in the community, that you really want to look at these trends and best practices and benchmarking, and then take a look at where is your library measuring up to things being done in similar size communities or similar demographic communities, and look at whether or not there's possibilities for change in your library based upon what's going on in other communities. To survey or not to survey? If I counted the hours that we've spent talking with our clients and amongst ourselves about this question, it would be amazing. Surveys are useful. The big question is whether or not they're very valuable. We have found that so often in doing community surveys, number one, you get responses mainly from users. It's very difficult to get a survey in the hands of a non-user because they're not going to be driven to the place where they have an opportunity to participate in the survey. And so you're going to get information that you're probably already getting. On the other hand, not doing a survey, which is the broadest way to collect community involvement or community input, says that you've sort of cut off a component of your community that you really don't want to do. It's very good to do an organizational assessment, to do that sort of looking at yourself from within the library, staffing, operations, budgets. How are we doing? How do we think we're doing? And then finally, you can do focus groups if you want. We have a bias that focus groups, whereas they're interesting at gathering some types of information, they're expensive, and rarely do you get directional information that really informs the strategic plan.
So it's important to summarize the data that you gather, and remember this is a strategic plan. It's not a be-all and end-all. It's looking at strategic issues and strategic directions for your libraries. So look at the data and summarize the key findings and issues. Include in that qualitative data, like the organizational assessment, which is, I think, largely a qualitative assessment. And in summarizing that data, you want to really look at what are the implications for planning. What are the big strategic issues? So summarizing the data, you may find that your book drop is in the wrong place. That's really not a strategic issue. On the other hand, if the data is showing that your customer service is poor, that's a pretty important strategic issue. So you really want to look at the implications for the big picture issues. And then out of that, you want to identify focus areas, which you may test then when you go out to the community. So data is incredibly important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. But it's really a good starting point for your strategic planning process.
We recently did a strategic plan for a town in Illinois that's looking at building a new building, a brand new building. And one of the things that we did with their community survey is we asked some questions about what's important for the physical qualifications of your library. Well, probably 75% of the respondents said parking, 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 parking. So they knew that a major issue in looking at building a new building is going to be accessibility. The town was really concerned that a new library had features that made users feel like they were safe. So what we were able to get out of this particular community survey is some issues that actually moved them quite far down the line when they began to create their feasibility study for their new building at what the community was already thinking about and looking for in a new library plan. So it sort of took it farther down the road than we might have expected.
And just to reinforce that briefly, I think it goes back to looking at what your goals are for the planning process, and that will actually help you determine what data you want to gather and what's critical to gather. So this is the end of our first webinar on planning, and I just really want to invite you to check us out at our website here. We also have a Facebook page and Twitter, and would always be happy to talk to you more about the planning process or any aspect that we might be able to help you with.
As I mentioned early on, this is part of a 3-part webinar series on the importance of planning. The next webinar will be on the rapid results planning process. And finally, if fundraising is one of your issues, Library Strategies, at the request of the American Library Association, wrote a book about 3 years ago called Beyond Book Sales, The Complete Guide for Raising Real Money for Your Library. This is a book that we have heard over and over. It's one of literally the most complete and usable books on fundraising for your library out there. So we'd invite you to take a look at the book and learn about it on our website.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.